The red live signal blinked on in the upper corner of the screen just as the camera zoomed into a studio drenched in artificial warmth and smug condescension. Sitting at the center of the high-profile panel was Greg Langston, a notoriously left-leaning media host known more for his venomous quips than for balanced journalism. He straightened his navy blue blazer, leaned forward, and grinned like a cat that had cornered a bird. Without even easing into it, he launched into a full-blown takedown of former President Donald Trump, calling him a washed-up demagogue who mistook Twitter rants for policy. The audience chuckled, more out of nervousness than genuine agreement. Honestly, Greg continued with exaggerated flair, Trump's legacy could fit on the back of a Happy Meal box and still leave room for fries. The panel, mostly liberal commentators, erupted in laughter except for one person, Kayleigh McEnany. Seated quietly at the edge of the panel in a crisp white blazer, Kayleigh didn't so much as twitch. She simply blinked once and stared at Greg like a lioness watching a hyena pretend to be king. Greg caught her expression and smirked. "Oh, don't worry, Kayleigh, you'll get your chance to defend the indefensible." The panel laughed again. One guest, a political analyst from Georgetown, leaned in and added, "I mean, who seriously believes Trump ever had a coherent plan beyond stroking his own ego?" Kayleigh's eyes flickered just briefly, like someone mentally noting the time of death. "Don't you think?" Greg pushed, desperate to bait her. But Kayleigh only tilted her head slightly, an unreadable smile teasing her lips. "I just want to be clear," Greg said mockingly. "We're talking about the man who told people to inject bleach, the same man who built a wall that Mexico never paid for. That's your champion?" Another round of shallow applause echoed. A makeup technician adjusted a camera angle, briefly panning across the tense faces of the producers watching behind the glass. They knew Kayleigh was waiting. The silence before she spoke was deafening. Greg, sensing he had center stage, went for the kill. "It's honestly laughable to me that anyone could defend Trump after January 6th. The man practically incited a civil war. But go ahead, Kayleigh. Tell America how that was part of the plan." One panelist, an economist, snorted with laughter so hard he spilled his water. Still, Kayleigh remained still. The camera caught her fingers slowly tapping the table, once, twice, 3 times. She looked at Greg the way a professor looks at a freshman who just used Wikipedia as a source. "What?" Greg asked with faux confusion. "Cat got your tongue? Or are the talking points still downloading from Mar-a-Lago?" Someone in the control room cringed audibly into their headset. The disrespect was blatant. The manipulation was rehearsed, and yet, Kayleigh didn't rise to it. Not yet. She glanced toward the studio audience and saw something fascinating. Doubt. Not everyone was laughing. A woman in the third row, clearly undecided, looked torn. Kayleigh clocked it. Greg leaned back, satisfied, wiping invisible dust off his notes like he had already won. "All right," he said, "let's move on to the next segment, shall we?" But Kayleigh lifted her hand slightly, and in that small gesture, the temperature of the entire room dropped. "Actually," she said quietly, "I think we should talk about Trump. Let's begin with some facts." Her voice was like glass, cold, sharp, and impossible to look away from. "Let's really talk." Greg blinked, thrown off, and for the first time that night, the audience leaned forward, not to laugh, but to listen. The gloves weren't coming off. They had never been on. What no one on that panel realized, not even the producers hidden behind the thick glass of the control booth, was that Kayleigh McEnany had arrived at the studio 3 hours early, alone, dressed in ivory, and carrying a black leather binder that might as well have been a loaded weapon. She'd walked past interns and media handlers, with the composure of a surgeon entering an operating room. Her heels clicked softly on the studio floor as she stepped into her private prep room, one usually reserved for high-profile guests or celebrities. But she wasn't here for glamour. This wasn't a press junket. She was here for something far more primal, to correct a narrative surgically, factually, and with a calm so unnerving it could melt steel. Inside her room, Kayleigh had spread out documents like a general reviewing battlefield. Maps, reports, transcripts, emails, screenshots of previous media lies, timelines, names. She had even highlighted moments when Greg Langston had deliberately misled viewers on live television, not once, not twice, but 15 times in the past 6 months alone. She knew his patterns, she knew his blind spots, and most terrifying of all, she knew exactly how he'd try to humiliate her. On a nearby iPad, she replayed old clips of him ambushing conservative guests with smirks and quick-cut edits. He thrived on chaos. He lived for applause from the predictable herd of virtue-signaling commentators who rarely pushed back and always let Greg finish his monologues uninterrupted. But Kayleigh wasn't wired like the rest. She had once stood behind the presidential podium while journalists hurled half-baked accusations like rotten tomatoes. She had kept her posture while wolves circled, and now, years later, she wasn't walking into a debate. She was walking into a trap she intended to turn into a grave. An assistant knocked once, nervous, before letting himself in to tell her they'd be going live soon. Kayleigh thanked him kindly and closed her binder with one hand. Her manicure was understated, her makeup flawless, her mind sharp enough to cut through steel and still not leave a fingerprint. When she stepped into the hallway leading to the sound stage, a young staffer offered her a bottled water. She declined. She didn't want distractions. She didn't want to sip while someone else was lying. She wanted her hands free, for notes, gestures, or metaphoric throat slitting. She passed the green room where other panelists were waiting, sipping coffee and laughing like the segment would be just another softball circus of clapping seals. Point one of them, Tom Harrison, a tech correspondent known for parroting CNN's talking points, nodded to her smugly. "Hope you brought your helmet," he said with a chuckle. "Greg's on fire tonight." Kayleigh smiled, not cruelly, but with an eerie grace. "No need," she said. "I'm not the one in the blast zone." He blinked. She walked on in the control room. A producer glanced at the rundown sheet and whispered to another staffer, "Watch her timing that if she speaks up too early, we cut the camera. If she waits, we go to break." The staffer nodded. They weren't protecting fairness. They were managing optics. If Kayleigh said something too good, too clear, too devastating, they would pull the plug. That was the plan, until it wasn't. Because moments before the live feed began, Kayleigh pulled out her binder, placed it just slightly off camera under the desk, and clipped a lavalier mic not to her collar, but just below her neckline. Why? Because she knew their mics would be selectively muted, especially hers, but her personal mic fed audio directly to her own device hidden under the table, a separate recorder that would capture the full, unedited version of the conversation. Let them cut her feed. Let them edit the replays. She was already 10 moves ahead. She smiled at the makeup artist applying finishing powder and said, "Do me a favor, don't mute the shine that I want the light to reflect." The artist blinked in confusion but nodded. When she stepped onto the set, cameras already rolling and audience mics peaking. Kayleigh was a picture of elegance, poised, understated, but lethal. Greg Langston was already in character. Loose shoulders, smug grin, gleeful malice beneath his studio smile. He welcomed the panel with a tone soaked in superiority. "Good evening to our viewers across America," he said. "Tonight we have a fantastic group joining us to talk about everything from inflation to misinformation. And yes," he chuckled, "we'll even give our favorite Trump apologist a chance to plead her case." He nodded toward Kayleigh with mock courtesy. She simply blinked once, no reaction, and that was exactly what confused him. She should have flinched. She should have defended herself. Instead, she watched, measured, and waited for the clock to tick just a bit closer to the 30-minute mark, when the first commercial break would typically hit, when the studio was least prepared to pivot. While Greg paraded his usual arrogance and theatrics, Kayleigh was watching the internal teleprompter reflection on his glasses, catching every word he read before he even said it. She could see when he veered off script, when he followed improv, when he leaned into personal digs. It was all part of her psychological map of the battlefield. She wasn't reacting because she wasn't confused. She was confirming that everything she'd prepared for was happening exactly as predicted. She wasn't calm because she was intimidated. She was calm because she was ready. The real show hadn't even started yet, and when she finally decided to speak, she wouldn't just respond. She would redefine the moment. Silence is a funny thing in a television studio. It's usually filled quickly by laughter, applause, cutaway jokes, or commercials. But in the 30 seconds after Greg Langston dismissed Trump's legacy and smirked in Kayleigh McEnany's direction, the silence wasn't accidental. It was engineered. Kayleigh leaned in slightly, her fingertips barely brushing the edge of the table, and said in a voice so measured it could have been scripted by a courtroom stenographer, "Let's actually talk about facts, Greg." Her voice wasn't angry. That would have been too easy to write off. That IT wasn't desperate. That would have played into their narrative. That IT was surgical, like a scalpel sliding into silk. Greg blinked. The audience stilled. Even the crew in the control booth leaned toward the monitors like something had just shifted, something they couldn't quite explain yet. Kayleigh reached down and opened her black leather binder. IT made the faintest click. That tiny sound, sharp and final, was the starting gun. "Let's start with the bleach lie," she said, flipping to the first page. April 23, 2020. President Trump says, and I quote, "It wouldn't be through injection, almost a cleaning, maybe light or heat," and then immediately adds, "I'm not a doctor, but I think it's something worth looking into." She looked directly at Greg. The full quote, not your edited one. Not the meme version, the actual transcript. Greg opened his mouth, but she kept going. "Now let's contrast that with your segment from April 24th. She flipped another page and held it up, revealing a transcript highlighted in 3 different colors. "You played 5 seconds of the clip, you removed his clarification, you framed it as a medical recommendation, which it was not, and then you ran a cheer in that said, and I quote, 'Trump suggests bleach injections.'" A murmur rippled through the audience. Greg's smile thinned. "Well, it was interpreted that way by many medical professionals," he began, but Kayleigh raised her hand slightly and interrupted, her voice still level. "You're a journalist, Greg, not a medical interpreter. Your job is to report what was said, not what you hoped it meant. The full video was available. You chose not to show it. That's not an accident, that's a decision." A camera operator instinctively zoomed in. Greg shifted in his seat. Point one panelist, seated to Kayleigh's left, started glancing at their notes as if looking for something, anything, to change the subject, but she wasn't done. Not even close. "Now," she said, flipping another page, "you mentioned the border wall." She She pulled out a Department of Homeland Security report. Would you like to explain why you told your audience on January 15, 2021, that not a single inch of Trump's wall was ever built? Greg scoffed lightly, but Kayleigh raised the document. This is a DHS summary of completed construction. 452 miles of that, 371 miles replaced outdated or broken barriers. 81 miles were brand new border wall systems. That's not a claim. That's a federal record. The panel was quiet. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. The mood had shifted. Somewhere in the studio, a junior producer whispered, "Are we still live?" And the tech nodded slowly, mouth slightly open. Greg tried to pivot. "Well, let's not pretend the wall stopped illegal immigration." "Did I say it did?" Kayleigh asked calmly. "I didn't say it stopped it. I'm pointing out your lie. You said nothing was built. That's what you told millions of people." Greg's jaw clenched. The Georgetown analyst tried to jump in with a half-hearted comment about broader trends in policy failure, but Kayleigh turned her head slightly, eyes like twin scalpels. "You're deflecting again." She closed the binder slowly, deliberately, then she looked into the camera. Not at the host, not at the panelists, but at the millions watching at home. "This is the problem," she said. "Not disagreement, not debate, but distortion. The media isn't afraid of Trump because he lies. They're afraid of him because he exposes theirs." You could hear a pin drop. Greg cleared his throat, trying to claw back control. "Kayleigh, with all due respect, the media holds power to account." "And who holds you accountable?" She shot back, louder now, her voice echoing. "Because right now, we're in a country where people trust podcasts more than the evening news, and instead of asking why, you double down. You mock, you lie, and you hope no one reads the transcript." The audience applauded, quiet at first, then growing. A live audience in the studio, applauding her. Greg raised his hand to cut to commercial, but the director in the booth hesitated. "No," someone whispered. "Let it play." Kayleigh leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice again. "You want to mock Trump? Fine, but don't lie to do it. Debate his policies, challenge his choices. But the second you lie, you lose the right to call yourself a journalist. You become a propagandist in a tie." The Georgetown analyst turned to her, visibly uncomfortable. "So you're saying the media is corrupt?" She looked at him with a calm smile. "No, I'm saying you are the corruption." Gasps, audibly. Someone in the control room cursed under their breath. The social media manager was already seeing #Kayleigh trending on the studio's internal feed. They had no idea how to spin this. They weren't prepared for clarity. "Facts are not violence," Kayleigh said, wrapping her point. "Truth is not extremism, and if your job is threatened by transparency, maybe you're in the wrong business." When the show finally cut to commercial, Greg Langston didn't say a word. His face was tight. The panelists avoided eye contact, and Kayleigh? She reached down, calmly turned off her private mic, and sat back with a small, satisfied smile, because the storm had landed, and it was just the beginning. When the commercial break ended, no one said a word for the first 5 seconds of AI or INTV time. 5 seconds of silence feels like 5 years of existential dread. Greg Langston stared at the camera, visibly rattled. His jaw was set too tight, his shoulders too high, and even his usually gleaming voice had a slight tremor as he stammered, "Welcome back." His words hung in the air like a balloon that wouldn't rise. The applause sign blinked weakly in the corner of the studio ceiling, but the audience didn't respond. They were still stunned, processing what they had just seen before the break, processing the woman who had sat quietly for nearly half the segment, and then dismantled a major media narrative in under 10 minutes without raising her voice. Greg glanced toward the producers for some sort of cue, but none came. The studio had slipped out of his control and everyone knew it. "So," he said, forcing a chuckle, "spirited discussion there before the break, but let's pivot to something lighter, shall we?" His tone tried for levity, but it landed awkwardly, like a clown slipping on his own oversized shoes. "Tom," he continued, gesturing toward the tech correspondent seated to Kayleigh's left, "you were saying before the show started that Trump's digital presence has all but collapsed. Want to elaborate?" Tom gave a stiff nod and began rattling off pre-rehearsed points about follower counts, Truth Social's market valuation, and Trump's supposed irrelevance. It was meant to be a palate cleanser, a safe topic designed to recover the rhythm of the panel, but halfway through his sentence, he faltered, because Kayleigh reached under the desk, retrieved her iPad, and tapped the screen without saying a word. A moment later, the audience's attention shifted as a visual appeared on the studio's massive digital monitor. Real-time analytics from Truth Social, showing record-breaking engagement numbers for a recent Trump video. Tom blinked. That's an isolated." Kayleigh finally spoke. "Tom, do you know what this data shows?" He hesitated. "Activity?" She looked at him like a disappointed professor. "It shows that despite a coordinated media blackout, a former president's direct-to-audience platform still outperforms multiple mainstream outlets on key engagement metrics. That's not collapse, that's independence." Tom fumbled. "But engagement doesn't mean credibility." "No," she said smoothly, "but suppression doesn't mean truth either. And if the media's credibility was as strong as you pretend, you wouldn't need to act like alternative voices are a threat. You'd just let them speak and win the argument on merit. But you can't, so you silence them." The audience murmured hammered again. This time louder. It wasn't polite confusion. It was approval. Someone clapped once. Then again. Then it spread like wildfire until a third of the room was applauding without being prompted. Not because they agreed with her politics, but because someone was finally saying what they had been afraid to. That truth should be allowed to stand on its own without censors, spin, or smug gatekeeping. Greg's face turned pink beneath the studio lights. Across the panel, Emma Carroll, a social commentator with a reputation for polite progressivism, shuffled her papers nervously. She looked toward Greg, toward Kayleigh, then back to the audience, and then, to everyone's shock, she leaned forward and said, "Okay, look. I didn't come here expecting to agree with you, Kayleigh, but you're not wrong about the censorship problem. I've had articles of mine shadow banned just for questioning certain economic policies. No conspiracy, just quiet removal. It's real." Greg snapped his head toward her. "Emma, are you serious?" She held up her hands defensively. "I'm not endorsing Trump. I'm saying we do have a credibility problem, and we don't fix it by pretending it's not happening." That was the first crack. Kayleigh didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply nodded once and offered a quiet, "Thank you for being honest." And that, more than any statistic or speech, hit harder than expected. Because the next crack came from the audience. A woman in her 60s stood up and said, out loud, "I don't even like Trump, but why do y'all keep lying about what he says? Just let us hear it and decide for ourselves." Her voice carried. A security guard started to approach but hesitated. The crowd clapped. Not wildly, not chaotically, just steadily, rhythmically, as if confirming what many had felt for too long but hadn't dared to say. Greg's control of the room was bleeding out. "Let's stay on topic," he barked, his voice now sharp and desperate. "We're not turning this into some anti-media rally." "But you did that," Kayleigh said quietly, her tone cutting like a scalpel. "When you stopped being a moderator and became a performer, when you turned disagreement into mockery, when you used your platform not to challenge power, but to mock the people who gave it to you." The room froze. Even the lights seemed to dim. "Greg," she continued, "your ratings dropped 7% every quarter. You've lost half your sponsors in a year, and your biggest engagement last month was a clip of you dancing with a sock puppet to mock Republicans. That's not journalism. That's a cry for relevance." Someone in the control room laughed. Greg turned beet red. "You know what?" he snapped. "Let's go to break." "No," said Emma suddenly. "Let it run." Greg looked at her like she had betrayed him. "What?" Emma crossed her arms. "You always say you care about open dialogue, right? So let it run." Now that got the audience. Cheers erupted, not for Kayleigh, not for Trump, but for freedom of speech, for the moment itself, for the idea that maybe, just maybe, they weren't crazy for feeling like the national narrative was being fed to them with a plastic spoon. And then came the death blow. Not from Kayleigh, but from a live poll flashed on screen, an unplanned Twitter poll synced by the production team. It had one question. Who's winning this discussion? For options, Greg, Kayleigh, the panel undecided. The votes surged in real time. Kayleigh, 89%. Greg's hand twitched toward his earpiece. "Kill the feed," he muttered, but it was too late. The public had spoken. The panel was no longer a panel. It was a courtroom, and Greg Langston had just lost the jury. The second the live indicator blinked off, the illusion shattered. What had once been a tightly controlled environment, the studio, the panel, the narrative, imploded behind the scenes with the suddenness of a dam bursting. Producers jumped from their seats in the control room, some shouting, others frantically pulling at headset cords like they were strangling them. Monitors flickered with real-time analytics. Viewership was skyrocketing, not slowly, exponentially. What started as a slow evening segment had become the network's most viewed broadcast in over a year, and for all the wrong reasons. Inside the studio, Kayleigh McEnany quietly removed her microphone with the composure of someone who hadn't just thrown a live grenade into a machine. She stood, calmly folded her binder, and thanked the makeup girl by name. The rest of the panel sat motionless. Emma Carroll still looked stunned. Greg Langston was rigid with rage, his hands clenched so tightly on the table his knuckles had gone bone white. "She ambushed me," he whispered to himself. "That was a setup. She ambushed me on my show." But the panic really began upstairs, on the 15th floor of the network headquarters, where the executive's war room lit up like a Christmas tree from hell. Screens everywhere, Slack channels blowing up, emergency calls pouring in from PR teams, sponsors, legal counsel, and even political consultants. The show had gone rogue. The segment that was supposed to humiliate a former White House press secretary had instead elevated her into a cultural juggernaut overnight, and it had happened live. "Damage control," barked the VP of programming, slamming her coffee down so hard it cracked the ceramic. "I want every replay segment offline now. Pull the clip from the site, flag it on social, have our in-house fact-checker draft a response, push a counter-narrative." She cherry-picked data, accuse her of distortion, something, but nothing stuck, because something else was happening. By the time Kayleigh left the building and stepped into the waiting SUV arranged by her team, hashtags were already trending worldwide. Hashtag Kayleigh was right. Hashtag media meltdown. Hashtag Greg got wrecked. Hashtag let her speak. Within 37 minutes, a 2-minute excerpt of her dismantling of the bleach hoax had gone viral. Over 3 million views on X, 2.7 million on TikTok. TikTok, and thousands of comments ranging from shocked moderates to reformed skeptics admitting they never saw the full quote before. One viewer wrote, "I hated Trump for the bleach thing. Now I hate the media for lying about it." That single comment racked up 84,000 likes in less than an hour. Meanwhile, inside the network's media management division, junior staffers tried to throttle the spread by issuing copyright claims. But Kayleigh's team had posted the unedited feed from her own mic, recorded independently under fair use, and worse, independent journalists were now fact-checking the fact-checkers, discovering that nearly everything she'd cited had been accurate, sourced, and public record. That's when the internal emails started leaking. First, it was a message from a mid-level producer sent just 12 minutes before the segment aired. It read, "We're expecting Kayleigh to go full spin mode. Let Greg poke her until she cracks. Don't let her control the conversation. If she veers, cut to B-roll." The leak wasn't accidental. It had been forwarded to 3 reporters and one conservative media watchdog site that published it with the headline, "Rigged from the start. Internal memo shows host set up Kayleigh McEnany to fail." And suddenly, the tide surged. Sponsors began pulling out, not because they were offended by what was said, but because they didn't want to be caught in the mess. The perception that the network tried to stage a hit job and failed on air was worse than just letting her speak. Advertisers didn't like being lied to either. Greg Langston, once the golden boy of left-wing late-night media, was now a liability. Internal conversations about suspending him until things cool off were circulating. HR quietly reached out to his assistant asking for a detailed log of off-air comments, hoping to find something else to pin a quiet exit on. Inside the SUV, Kayleigh took a call from a conservative media CEO offering her a primetime guest hosting slot. She politely declined, for now. Another call came through from a podcast platform offering her a massive contract for an exclusive deal. Her response, "I'm not looking for a platform. I already have one." The truth. Back in the building, Greg stormed into the control room demanding to know who had let her speak for that long. "We cut conservatives," he screamed. "That's the rule. We don't let them build momentum." Where were the King producers? One of the editors, barely older than a college intern, shot back, "We tried, but the audience was cheering. And you didn't stop her." That last sentence wasn't said with anger. It was said with disappointment, like a child watching their hero fall. The situation worsened when conservative and centrist networks began replaying the segment, branding it the most honest 12 minutes of media this year. Even traditionally liberal outlets like The Hill and Breaking Points covered it neutrally, stating that Kayleigh McEnany delivered a fact-heavy, brutal correction that exposed major media missteps. By morning, the network stock dipped 2.3%. The PR team issued a generic apology for editing issues, hoping it would die down. But Kayleigh wasn't done. She posted a tweet at 6:17 a.m. the next day. "Truth doesn't need help. It just needs to be heard. Thank you to the millions who listened. To those who tried to silence it. You only made it louder." And with that, the internet exploded again. Greg Langston's profile went private. The network locked comment sections across all video platforms. The hashtag Let Kayleigh debate became a trending petition, signed by hundreds of thousands calling for a live, uninterrupted debate series hosted by independent moderators. Meanwhile, another leak surfaced. A memo from the network's legal department. It contained a terrifying admission. If Kayleigh McEnany sues for defamation or targeted bias, given the leaked instructions and real-time analytics, we have no defense. She will win. She didn't sue. She didn't need to. She had already won in the court of public opinion. And for a media empire built on illusions, that was the one verdict they couldn't spin, edit, or mute. The world didn't just wake up the next morning. It snapped to attention. The sun hadn't even fully risen over Manhattan before national headlines erupted across every major outlet, left and right, digital and traditional. Cable networks scrambled for footing. Reddit threads burst at the seams. YouTubers dropped. Emergency live streams dissecting every moment of the now iconic exchange. But even as the conversation roared globally, Kayleigh McEnany remained conspicuously silent. No interviews, no podcasts, no statements. Her team ignored hundreds of media requests, and that silence was louder than any tweet, until it wasn't. 72 hours after the broadcast, a countdown timer appeared on Kayleigh's personal website. It read, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Thursday night, no interruptions and no edits, just truth. Beneath the timer, a single word in stark white text on a black screen. Watch. Speculation exploded. Was it a documentary? A podcast? A live response? Twitter was on fire. TikTok influencers made conspiracy videos about what she would say. #Kayleigh returns trended for 16 hours straight. Liberals braced for spin. Conservatives prepped popcorn. And the network? They issued a statement insisting she was misleading viewers with selective facts. But they knew what was coming. Behind closed doors, they even discussed sending legal threats if she used any internal footage. But Kayleigh didn't need them. Thursday night hit, and her stream went live. No fancy set, no flash flashy graphics, just Kayleigh, seated at a modest desk in a library surrounded by shelves stacked with policy books, court rulings, and archived speeches. She wore soft blue, symbolic, maybe, of reason. Her tone was calm, no teleprompter, no notes, just one camera point, one woman, and a nation leaning forward. 3 days ago, she began, I sat on a panel designed to silence me. It didn't work. Not because I shouted louder, but because I brought something more powerful than spin, proof. She held up a stack of documents, the same binder from the broadcast. And now I'm going to show you all of it. What followed wasn't a rant. It was a masterclass in receipts. She played full-length clips of Trump's so-called controversial statements, followed immediately by the network's edited versions. She laid them side by side, date by date, source by source. Viewers saw the exact moments words were clipped, reshaped, and framed for maximum outrage. Here's Trump saying we must protest peacefully, she said, cueing a clip. Here's the version the media ran, cut at the 4-second mark, removing peacefully. That's not journalism. That's propaganda. She exposed another instance, a quote about immigration twisted beyond recognition. Then she moved to COVID. Here's the full CDC email about reopening. Here's the media headline that ran the next morning, Trump ignores science, when in fact, he cited this exact document word for word. It wasn't just about defending Trump. It was about exposing the entire machine. Then, midway through the stream, she paused. What I did that night, she said softly, wasn't revolutionary. I didn't scream. I didn't insult. I didn't beg for fairness. I simply told the truth, and I dared the media to respond. And how did they respond? By leaking memos, censoring clips, and threatening to sue. She leaned forward. They're scared, and they should be, because for the first time, they were held accountable. Then she dropped the bomb. I have over 1,200 pages of internal communications from network staff, leaked, anonymously, sent to me after the segment aired, pages that include directives to target right-wing guests. Cut them before momentum builds. And quote, use editing as defense when truth is inconvenient. She flashed a few pages on screen, blurred names, visible context. I'm not releasing all of them. Not yet, but I will if I'm forced to. The internet exploded. Reddit threads hit 20,000 plus comments. Hashtag Kayleigh Files trended worldwide. Reporters from The Intercept and The Daily Wire alike begged for access. The clip of her revealing the 1,200 pages received 27 million views in the first 5 hours. That's when he posted at exactly 9:48 p.m. Donald J. Trump broke his silence on Truth Social. Kayleigh McEnany just showed the world what real courage looks like. Brilliant, classy, deadly accurate. They tried to shame her for defending me. Now the world's ashamed of them. I couldn't be prouder. Hashtag media exposed. Hashtag truth matters. The ripple became a tsunami. Right-leaning networks ran full segments hailing Kayleigh's takedown as the turning point in the credibility war. Even some centrists applauded the clarity, and a few prominent leftist pundits were cornered into admitting they had never seen the full clips she aired. And within hours, 2 unexpected dominoes fell. Emma Carroll, the liberal panelist who had sided with Kayleigh mid-show, announced her resignation from the network the next morning, citing a toxic culture of narrative enforcement. She posted a short video on X saying, if you need to edit the truth to stay relevant, you're no longer a journalist. Greg Langston was suspended, pending internal review. Leaks confirmed he had approved multiple segment edits later proven misleading. The network issued a 1-sentence statement. Greg Langston is no longer with the company. But the most shocking twist, Kayleigh never celebrated publicly, no gloating tweet, no victory lap, no monetized reaction videos. Instead, she posted one final message 2 days later. I don't want a show. I don't want a title. I don't want applause. I want my daughter to grow up in a country where truth isn't partisan. If that offends you, maybe ask yourself why. And just like that, she went silent again. She walked away while the fire still burned. And that silence, that final moment of restraint, it made the entire nation listen even harder.